Howdy, folks. This is Dr. Todd. Welcome to another episode of the Dr. Todd Podcast. In today's episode, I want to talk about hostage situations versus relationships. Now, let me explain a little bit what I mean by this, because I know the word itself, hostage, has a lot of it's fairly emotionally charged. When people hear that word, they're like, it feels very unsafe. It feels like you're a captive. It feels dangerous. It feels really bad. And when it comes to relationships, there are a lot of different ways that we can become hostages to our partner. And I use that term very intentionally because it describes a dynamic that can emerge in some relationships that can become quite toxic if they're not addressed. So let me talk a little bit about what I mean by a hostage situation in a relationship. So the basic idea of a healthy, functional relationship is that both partners can be active agents in the relationship, meaning that they collaborate and both of them compromise and they do a little bit here and there and they come to some agreement that may not necessarily be all one person or all the other, but that there is some compromise and there's some ability to be fluid and interact with each other so that they can find some balance that meets the needs of both people. Now, there may be some who will be very fixated on blinds versus drapes in the house, and the other person's kind of like, meh, it's not that important to me, whatever, just, let her or let him do whatever they want, because frankly, I'm just not that emotionally tied into that decision. And then that's fine, right? Because it's not like one person is having to subvert their own needs so that the other partner is getting their needs met. There are other times when the needs of one partner become the priority oftentimes to the detriment of the other, where it's like, nope, this is what I want. And it doesn't matter what you want. It doesn't matter what's important to you. It doesn't matter how much anxiety or distress or harm this causes to you. The only thing that matters is what I want, because in the idea of me having to compromise is just too distressing, and it is just I can't do that. And so you have to adapt to me so that I can be okay, but I do not have to come outside of my own comfort zone and help you get your needs met or make sure that you are okay. And this is what I mean by a hostage situation, right? It's one of these things where instead of a relationship being a situation where both partners can simultaneously be a caregiver and a care receiver for and from the other, right? There's situations where sometimes one person is the caregiver and sometimes the other, right? Where they try to make the other person feel better and be supportive and things like that. And when both partners can do that and there's some flexibility there, that's a sign of a healthy relationship. So for example, if one partner comes home from work and has had a tough day, right? The other partner can be like, you know what? I can kind of put my plans aside and kind of subvert my own needs for the time being in order to be supportive. So, do you want to go to dinner? What would be helpful? Is there anything that I can do? And for the short term, it's like I can become the caregiver for you because I know that at some point in the future, I may be sick or I may have had a bad day, and you would do the same for me, right? That there would be a time when I have a need for support and you can be there for me. That kind of flexibility and the ability of both partners to try to serve and satisfy the emotional needs of the other is a sign of a good relationship, right? In toxic relationships, however, one of the partners is unable to be in that caregiver role. And it's like the other person always has to be the one doing all of the emotional work in the relationship because one partner is unwilling or unable to address some of their own stuff, some of their own emotional stuff, behavioral stuff that is creating some difficulty in the relationship or causing some distress in the relationship. And you see this a lot in families where, one partner has an active addiction or whether there's some significant mental illness or even a physical illness, a significant like terminal or major medical illness where they are just unable to, for whatever reason, unable to show up in the relationship in a way where there's some mutuality, right? Where, both partners, not only the person who is suffering, but also the other partner can both get some needs met. And instead, it becomes, everything becomes about the one partner. And this is kind of what I call a hostage situation, right? Where one person is kind of stuck doing all of the emotional work in the relationship. They are the ones having to do all of the sacrifice. They are the ones who are having to give up themselves. They're the ones that are having to dismantle their own boundaries. They're the ones who are having to undermine their own sense of self in order to manage the emotional life of the other partner, right? And this is a very, very unhealthy situation. Now, I should just make a note that if under normal circumstances, right, both partners have a lot of mutuality, and they've had a history of both being present for the other, and one partner has like a major medical illness, it is not necessarily that the other partner is wounded or injured by the inability of the ill partner to be present in a way that they used to be. It still is hard because the person who is offering support oftentimes feels unsupported or feels alone and may feel guilty for wanting some support themselves or wanting some comfort themselves when their partner is sick and they are, it's really important for them to be okay and for them to heal or just be comforted if they're in hospice or they've got some kind of terminal illness. And there may be just a sense of guilt of like, oh my God, I feel so insensitive or I feel so callous for wanting to feel comforted or needing to feel some support myself when my partner clearly is going through so much stuff. But that's not necessarily the kind of thing that I'm talking about. I mean, that's a tough deal. That's a tough situation, right? But the kind of thing, when I'm talking about a hostage situation, what I'm talking about more is like somebody who has an active addiction, right? And people with an active addiction are unable to show up in a relationship in a healthy way. And so their sickness, their addiction becomes kind of the epicenter around which everything else in the family has to organize. It's like everyone else's needs have to be subverted to try to support and to try to manage the emotional and mental life of the person at the epicenter who is in this case addicted, or they have some other kind of mental illness. What that results in, unfortunately, is that all of the other people in their orbit start to lose their sense of self, start to feel like it is their role to manage the emotional life of the person in the center in order to maintain the system, right? In order to maintain that family system, in order to maintain some stability. And what you oftentimes see in family situations that are like that is, there may be one of the family members or a kid or a cousin or an uncle or a brother or something who speaks up and says, this is bullshit. This is an unhealthy situation, right? Why is it my responsibility to manage the emotional life of a person who is unwilling to do anything themselves? They're unwilling to change. They are unwilling to really address some of their own demons and how they are affecting the rest of the family system and how they're hurting everybody else in the family system. And when somebody does speak up like that in a situation like this, they are oftentimes the ones who are blamed. They're the ones to be, who are shamed and like, how dare you treat him like that? Or how dare you say that about our family? And are oftentimes become the black sheep because they are disrupting this family system that is very unhealthy. And when couples come in to see me where there is this kind of unhealthy dynamic set up where it is the role of one person to always be doing all of the emotional work for the other, addressing that situation is oftentimes very difficult, because the moment that I call out this dynamic, then it's like, well, we're going to stop therapy because the person who is the addict or the person who has the mental illness or the person who has the personality disorder or the person who is at the epicenter of this unhealthy situation is so unwilling to look at themselves. They have totally externalized, in most cases. They just tend to externalize the blame for their own, discomfort and for their own emotional kind of chaos and depression and anxiety and fears and anger and all of that. Things tend to be externalized. So it's all them. What I see oftentimes in therapy when there's a situation like that in a family, I'm just going to call it the unhealthy partner, right? The partner who is stuck either in kind of that personality disorder or that addiction or that mental illness. It's kind of like they want to kind of recruit me to help me beat up on their partner for them for not doing enough or not showing up in the right way or whatever. And oftentimes it's the person who is being blamed is the one who is often doing so much of the emotional work, right? They are the ones who are, trying to make things better, trying to make the wounded person or the addict or the person suffering from mental illness feel better, but are just kind of at their wits' end, and they're like, I don't know that I can continue going on in this relationship. When I talk about a hostage situation, these are the kinds of things that I'm talking about, right? Where there is one person in a relationship that is just unable or unwilling to look at their own stuff, to take some accountability, to try to evolve themselves in order to provide caregiving to their partner, in order to be present with their partner and what their partner needs, and to be thinking about, what can I do in order to help support and be present with my partner? And what can I do? How can I, where are some things, or where are some areas that I can evolve a bit or step outside of my comfort zone a little bit once in a while in order for them to feel better, right? Or in order for them to feel supported. And when that doesn't happen, right, then you no longer have a relationship where there's collaboration, right? You have a very toxic, dysfunctional, emotional hostage situation where it becomes the job of one person to manage the emotional life of the other. And there's oftentimes a lot of blame and shame and undermining the sense of the self that occurs in that situation in order to sustain that. And when the person who just becomes fatigued, just like, God, I have no more to give. I can't do this anymore. I just cannot do this anymore. I feel so unsupported. I feel alone. I feel like nothing I ever do is enough. I feel like, it's always about you, and I just can't do this anymore, and I am out of here. Then all of a sudden, that toxic person, because they need that other partner so desperately to try to maintain their own emotional state, their own emotional balance, just like, oh baby, don't leave. I'll change. I'll do anything. Please, I'll even go to treatment. I'll go to therapy. And they do for a week or two or do whatever in order just to get the person back into that orbit, right? Into that orbit. And then very soon, because there hasn't been any real evolution in that addicted, personality disordered, mentally wounded person, because there hasn't really been any evolution, eventually things kind of settle back into the previous orbit, right? And now all of a sudden, it's like, you made all these promises and now it's literally a month and we're just back to the same old thing. And now if I try to step away, or I try to leave, or I do leave, now all of a sudden there's this trying to cling me back or blaming me, like, you never loved me, you never did blah, blah, blah. It's all you. And then you kind of combined with, don't leave me. I need you. I'll do anything. I'll change. Right? Because in that emotional hostage situation, that wounded person, right, that needs the emotional support of the other in order to maintain a sense of personal integrity, in order to maintain some emotional balance. It's almost like they need something to beat up on, and then that will love them back in order to kind of maintain some status quo. And this can happen in a number of areas, right? It can happen in literally physical domination, and you oftentimes see this in domestic abuse situations. And I mean, in my time doing couple therapy, I've had some stories that are just shocking to the senses of things that people have done to their partners with physical violence and sexual violence in order to try to compel them to get them back into that orbit. But there's also a lot of emotional stuff that happens, shaming, blaming, undercutting, sarcasm, anything to try to keep that partner engaged and in that orbit. And what I would tell you is that if you are in in kind of one of those emotional hostage situations, you got to get out. You just got to get out. I have never seen a situation where that relationship can evolve to a place where it's healthy. I've just never seen it. It is not that the addict, it's not that the person at kind of the epicenter of the dysfunction cannot evolve, but it's that by this relationship continuing, it keeps both partners stuck in that dynamic. Now, I will say that in the case of addiction, if somebody goes to therapy or goes to treatment, they get sober, and they're sober for a considerable amount of time, and they are actively engaged in their own recovery. That is the only circumstance where I've seen that dynamic evolve. Otherwise, I've never seen it. I've never seen that really change. because when people are, in orbit around each other in that kind of circumstance, they tend to hold each other in that orbit. And that dynamic has to break in order for there to be any hope of each individual really getting some help and success. When we grow up in homes where we just kind of witness and experience a lot of that dysfunctional stuff among our parents, and then we experience some of those relationships in adulthood, we will tend to either be the person at the epicenter or the person who is always giving of themselves to the point of self-harm, where we cannot set boundaries. We become a people pleaser. We feel it's our responsibility to kind of make the bad boy feel better, or to try to rescue the other person. We want to rescue them from their own pain and want to save them from that. And we will tend to just jump from relationship to relationship in that role, or as the toxic one, unless we really do some personal healing ourselves. The reason why I did this podcast really was just to bring attention to this phenomenon of kind of this hostage situation thing when it comes to relationships. And it is just so important, if you feel like you are in one of those situations, to get out, right? And it sucks. And sometimes there's kids involved, and sometimes there's homes involved, and there's a lot to disentangle. But remaining in those situations is not good for us emotionally. It is not good for us mentally, and it is not good for the other partner either. And it doesn't mean that the two people cannot remain friends or remain engaged in some way, particularly if there are children involved. But that dynamic where there is this kind of this black hole sucking all the energy out of the surrounding stars, that is the thing that needs to end if we are to really heal and move forward in a positive way in our lives. So anyway, if you have any questions about any of that stuff, please feel free to leave a comment or shoot me an email from my website, drtodd.com. And be sure to hit the subscribe button. That helps me a lot, because the number of subscribers YouTube uses to kind of gauge whether this is good information or not, right? So the more that you hit that subscribe, the more that YouTube goes, oh, people like this stuff, let's show more of it, which just helps me out. So I hope you enjoyed this episode, and we will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.